very much for being patient. Just some unfortunate technical difficulties, so just copying across my presentation to this Mac, which will allow me to start proper. So I thought I would just start by talking a bit about myself and improvising with just an article that I have online, which has some of the images which will be a part of the presentation. In general, the title of the talk is Adaptive Gameplay Aesthetics, but you could also say it's sort of if Leonardo da Vinci were to create a video game, which techniques would he use? So this is, in summary, the kind of approach to game design that I take. My background is that I worked at Sony Computer Entertainment after graduating in computer animation, and I was very excited by that job initially, but I realized that my digital art education had, in a way, limited my scope for my career. I realized that if I want to be sort of the artist that I want to be, which was a concept artist in a way, someone who gets to define the artistic vision for the video game, then I have to study classical art. And once I started studying classical art, in the form of oil painting, figurative, and portraiture, I got so taken by the craft, so the techniques that I was learning, that I realized that there's just not enough time I'm studying to learn all these things. So what I did was I quit my job at Sony and started to paint. So for 2 years solidly I was just studying. And for a long time, it was sort of two separate disciplines that I was doing. I was sort of working in games to make money, but my real passion was in painting and learning about the craft. And then it was just a chance opportunity to discuss sort of how my fine art influences my game design work or my game artwork. That I started to really consider rather than thinking of these two disciplines as very separate, what are the actual connections between these two things? And that sort of holds true for the general conception of video games. Like, we tend to think that games and virtual reality are revolutionary, that they're completely new art forms and they have sort of nothing in common with what came before. But even game design, not even talking about game art, like the visual side of how we create characters and environments and vehicles. I'm talking about the core of what it is to make a video game, and that's all the rules and the interactions that are created through the dynamic experiences that they generate. And so what happened was, when I started to sort of think about this overlap, I came to sort of write a book called Drawing Basics in Video Game Art, which is the one on the left, which was very proudly endorsed by John Romero, so one of the co-founders of ID Software. And last year I published Interactive Stories in Video Game Art, so that was endorsed by Mark Forster, the Hollywood director of World War Z and James Bond, Quantum of Solace and Kite Runner. So it was very exciting to sort of start to see that my work was being validated in a way, but it's only until now and the framework that I'm presenting to you that game designers have started to take an interest, because up until now it was game artists who understood the value of things like composition and shape language, whereas now sort of game designers are starting to take an interest. Just sort of flick through these. How much time do we have? Is it just almost? Okay, just a minute. Okay, we can start with the main exercise. Even there's one here. Sorry, I'll come back to these in a minute. The idea is that if I were to ask you which shape would you identify yourselves with, a circle, square, or a triangle, then it's often very difficult for us to to objectively define ourselves in this way. So, like, are you a circle? Are you a square, or are you a triangle? And the idea is that it is a subjective thing, but the purpose of this talk is to sort of try to bring some objectivity to this experience. So the idea is, like, what I want to do by the end of this talk for you to actually have a lot of confidence in sort of deciding, okay, I am a circle, I am a square or a triangle, because these shapes in a historical context have very strong objective value that artists have been using in the context of craft, so something that is teachable, something that artists traditionally spent 5 or 10 years at least training before they were sort of considered a master painter, like in the traditional atelier system. If I were to ask you, how would you picture your journey to the conference today? Were you zigzagging through the traffic in a speeding taxi, or did you walk around the pool outside at the Novotel Hotel? Was it more functional, so you felt, I'm getting there, sort of like walking in straight lines then? Thinking about this circle, square, and triangle, so it's a bit easier. Sort of was the pathway jagged, curving, or fluid? And so what I'll ask you in a moment is to copy 2 signatures. Like I tend to ask people to have a pencil and paper ready, but it's actually something that we can even do as a whole group. I'll ask you just to hold up your hands like this when the presentation loads. So just in summary, these are some of the graphics I would have shown. So Sony Computer Entertainment, classical arts. And this is the kind of thing I do. The most creative thing that I do now, the most artistic, is every 2 weeks I organize a live drawing group where I have cosplayers come and dress up as video game characters or animation characters, and the artists have 1, 2, or 5 minutes to draw the figure before the pose changes. And this is, I think, the most applicable thing to what I'm teaching today, is that, you know, in this 1 minute or 2 minutes that I have, every line has to be placed in the right position, has to have the right length, the right shape. And so line itself has a lot of artistic value that you really learn from drawing, and this very, very much applies to what I'll be talking about today. This is the shapes that I asked you to identify with all your journey to work. And here's the exercise. So if you were to do your, if you were to do your signature, so the same one that you do to sign a contract or something like that, if you just do it instead by holding your hand up like this and sort of just mimicking the gestures that you would do. So if everyone could just hold up their hand, it's easier if everyone's doing it, and just draw your signature, sort of like in the shapes like this. Okay, so which shape would you identify that with? So are the gestures kind of rounded? Are they very jagged? Do you tend to write in a more horizontal and vertical lines? You know, then that's a bit more objective. It's easier than saying, are you a circle, square, and triangle? You can actually say, well, when I write my signature is roundish or triangular-ish. Whereas what happens if you try and copy the signature? So again, just hold your hand up like this and try to sort of feel the gestures. And how does it feel in your shoulder to write that? So the more theatrical, the better. Circles, the bigger that is. What about a signature like this? So it's like a lot more jagged. You have to imagine how quickly the person wrote. And also, you know, all the time think about what is the physical sensation of doing this, like all the way up through your elbow, up to your shoulder. And then what is interesting about this is that the top one is Barack Obama and the bottom one is Donald Trump. And so what you've just done is you've physically empathized with these figures. You know, they might be real or imagined, but this demonstrates that we can use shape language, especially the idea of mimicking the gestures of somebody to create a strong sense of embodiment. The idea that, you know, visual art can influence how you feel and influence how you sort of emotionally feel and physically feel. And so the idea of this sort of embodiment, or how visual art is conveyed to us, sort of dates back to sort of times like the Renaissance and even before that, where we have on one side cultural content in a painting like this. And cultural content is subjective. You know, the artist who painted this, Vermeer, would have a very different understanding of all the figures and elements within this painting, sort of very different to each one of us. And even though, you know, the time when he painted it to the time we are now is sort of one kind of gap in understanding, it's also between us. You know, we will all have a different understanding of this painting based on our individual backgrounds, sort of historical awareness of these paintings, and so on. Whereas one thing which is constant, the craft, is something which is objective and something that we can continue talking about to this day with a lot of certainty. And that's the fact that he spent months or even years organizing this painting along a hidden system of lines. And so nothing is randomly positioned. The idea is that, the lady's curl of her arm down to her fabric here, the position of the elements down here, the shadow edge as it runs along here. So like all of those are deliberately positioned to sort of create this hidden circular composition, so complemented by harmonious curved lines and one stabilizing line in the middle. And the idea is that composition has a lot of important functions when we're designing illustrations and sort of two-dimensional art. One of them is, at the vignettes, you can see at the corner, so the position of these figures, that keeps your eye within the painting. But what's central to this image is a triangular composition. So you have to think, why did this artist choose a triangular composition over a circular one that we saw in the previous painting? One of them is visual simplification. So if we remove the cultural content and just focus on the composition, then we can maybe appreciate why this is important. So I would like to ask you to just focus on this dot and ask yourself, is it a comfortable experience? Does your eye jump around? And it's usually quite easy just to focus on it. Your eye isn't tempted to move around in any way. Whereas if I add a vignette, then this experience becomes even easier. Sort of your eye is even less likely to escape the bounds of the canvas or the image. And this is what composition does. You have cultural content, and composition organizes that content in a way that the artwork becomes more immersive and easier to understand. So the audience isn't wasting time and energy trying to make sense of bringing their own sort of sense of order to the image. You present it in a very, very easy and manageable way. Whereas this is the equivalent of a composition which has no organization. So there's just a random collection of dots, and try focusing on one of these and see how irritating it is to have this neighboring spots all around. And this is what happens with an artwork which doesn't have this simplicity, this composition structure hidden within it. So composition has one very important function, which is the visual simplification. It's a visual guide, so anything which sits along this composition structure will naturally attract more attention to it than things which are sitting outside. So you'll see in comic book design, this is used to guide the viewer's eye to important speech bubbles or facial expressions that are an important part of the narrative. To convey story or subtext, so the idea that each one of these shapes has important artistic value which can support or subvert the narrative that is being presented. And by its definition, sort of composition is a very, very important tool for holistic design because, of course, in every artistic discipline, every design discipline, starting with the details is the worst thing that you could do. Sort of thinking about how everything connects together is the best approach. So you're always working from big concepts to small ones. And because composition is about that very thing, about finding a structure that simplifies and connects everything, things which are not important are subverted or subdued or dismissed altogether, then you arrive at something which is, gets to the point, to the essence of your artwork. And one thing that is important about classical composition is the fact that it's often broken in a way. So like the artists will use contours, fabric, shadow edges, expressions. So these little sort of indications that the composition is there, but they'll break it just enough that you as a viewer are not aware of it, unless you sort of studied this concept. And the reason for this is sort of related to things where you as an artist, you want the audience to really focus on the cultural content. You don't want them to be worrying about or sort of even contemplating the engineering and the design that went into this image. It's just about the narrative. You want them to really immerse themselves in the narrative. And the equivalent to this is if you're watching something like The Lord of the Rings or your favorite action film, and you're so immersed in the climax, the action and everything, and then suddenly the cameraman drops the microphone into the scene and a cameraman pops into the frame, and you suddenly realize, actually, this isn't real. There's a whole team of filmographers standing behind this. And this is the same with composition. You don't want the composition itself to become the center of the artwork. it should be hidden in the background. And so that's why, on a psychological level, if you're interested in psychology, sort of one concept that this whole system relates to is Gestalt Theory, so the idea of a unified whole, but especially feature integration theory, where you deal with the pre-attentive stage. So this is where your subconscious is analyzing your environment around you, and this happens before your conscience. It starts to analyze and sort of in a more conscious way switches to this focused attention stage. So composition works at its best when it stays at this pre-attentive stage. So the audience is looking at the cultural content in a very conscious way, but the composition is affecting their emotions and the way they feel on the pre-attentive level. So the question we have to ask ourselves is this still relevant to us today? I showed you an image which kind of relates to the Renaissance. Is it a sort of current and international? So is it just a Western concept, or will we find it in other art forms? And the answer, we can see some evidence that the answer to this is yes. If we look at the classical 5 elements in ancient history, where we had, the water, earth, fire, ether, and so on, because the ancient Greeks philosophized that these were like the Minecraft building blocks of our universe. They were sort of the pre the atom. And so our world was made of these invisible shapes, and they predicted that water was a sphere because it rolls around. Earth was the cube because of its mass and the fact that it can tessellate, you can stack it like in Minecraft. And fire was made of the pyramids because when you touch it, the tactile sensation gives you a fire-like feeling. And so this is an amazing thing, because what we have is this idea, this concept that links visual shapes, geometry, something which even has roots in mathematics, with tactile sensations. What does it actually feel like to hold each one of these? And what's interesting is that these 5 classical elements, or these 3 in particular, are evidenced in ancient Buddhist culture. They're evidenced in ancient Hindu culture as well. So there was something that connected us all together. If we look towards nature, we sort of realize that why the ancient Greeks and the Buddhists and Hindus came to these conclusions, because they were also studying nature, and they realized that anything which moves has circular forms. Dolphins evolved over millions of years to have the shape that they have, because round shapes are the most efficient forms to create streamlined, fast movement. If a dolphin was designed like a Minecraft dolphin made of blocks, then of course it wouldn't move efficiently through water. It would be ineffective at doing the function that it's been evolved to do. Anything which is going to need stability or rest, is going to be sort of either lying down flat or growing in a very balanced, upright position. Whereas anything, the teeth of a baboon, for instance, are going to be very sharp, because those are efficient shapes to perform the function that the teeth are designed to do, to attack, defend, or tear. Engineers throughout history have seen that these shapes have practical value. So if we look at ancient Sumerian mosaics featuring cots, the wheels are round. If you're an engineer designing square wheels, of course your life as a career as an engineer wouldn't last very long. The stones at Stonehenge are still standing to this day, despite being, over 3,000 years old, because of their upright forms. These are objective things that we can all agree upon. And the Clacton spear is the world's the oldest known spear to man, 420,000 years old. And of course, it's modeled on a canine tooth, something that's very sharp and efficiently can cut and slice and tear through an enemy or through a piece of food. And so the idea is that even if we're told that sharks are our friends, they're here to be protected, and there's something in us that understands that triangular shapes are dangerous, no matter how much creating this interesting contrast that we experience in Finding Nemo. So the idea is that there is this suggestion that this is an objective language, circles, squares, and triangles, because they represent sort of our natural environments. This is how nature has evolved to take advantage of these traits associated with each shape. What's interesting is that it really is an international language, suggested by this, that this is like how Buddha was originally presented. So he didn't have a human form, he was aniconic. And so he was presented as his footprints, some objects associated with him. But then the ancient Greek ruler Alexander the Great invaded the Gandhara regions of modern-day Afghanistan, Pakistan. And what happened was there was actually a lot more cultural tolerance, so religions, philosophy, mathematics, and all these things, then we tend to appreciate. So this is a part of the ancient Silk Road, which, we sort of identify things on this scale with modern times and the internet, but this was going on a huge global scale throughout ancient history. And so what happened was that Buddha suddenly took on a human form. It was the first time. And so his facial features were inspired by the Apollo Belvedere, so his hair. You can see Buddha's protector here is styled on Hercules, an ancient Greek god. But the cultural exchange went the other way. So you often see Christ with poses that mirror Buddha's, so like gestures that sort of appear like this, or like this. So these weren't present in sort of Christian artwork until this cultural exchange happened. But what's important for us is this overlap between shape language and craft and the tactile experience of these artworks, or how they affect us physically. And so what's important about when we look at the Buddha is the fact that he's an aid to meditation. The idea is that his shape language, so you can see sort of formed as a triangular form, so it's very stable, but with very rounded edges, rounded themes for his drapery, but a very symmetrical triangle. This is very, very important. And the idea is that you, as any Buddhist, is encouraged to sit in this pose and absorb this stability and this warmth that the shape exudes. So we have this very, very important connection between, again, shape language and how we feel and physically engage with an artwork. Looking towards Hercules, or the Buddha's protector, he actually transformed, this is a representation of him using more traditional Buddhist iconography, so the cultural content has changed, but the shape language is what we're analyzing. So can anyone see what kind of shape the composition of his figure has been based on? So it's more triangular, but it's asymmetrical, so you can see the apex is off to one side. And the language itself, so if you run up the one leg up to the arm, it's still a triangle, but it's an asymmetrical triangle with a more sharper edged motif. And so what's interesting is that this figure, which originated in ancient Greek cultures, Hercules, then became Buddha's protector, went all the way to Japan. And so now you have the protector gods outside Buddhist temples, known as Neo, standing two of them in exactly the same pose that you see here. Every single muscle is tense, they're sort of very vengeful gods. And the Zen monk Suzuki Shosan said that he would encourage his followers to actually adopt this pose. He would say, look at these gods, stand in this pose, in a vengeful pose, whenever you feel weak. Because by standing in this pose, you'll absorb their energy and feel more confident and more powerful. So this is, again, a very, very interesting aspect of shape language, how it can affect us physically. Just like the signature drawing exercise that I asked you to do at the beginning. In Islamic art as well, Islamic art, as I've written here, is a style founded on the study of nature, so symbolizing Allah's perfection, primary shapes intricately combined to illustrate Allah's infinite complexity. So even though Islamic art has remained aniconic, so it doesn't have any figurative representation in it, it still uses the same concepts. Islamic artists also came into contact with Alexander the Great, but they sort of, mixed it in with their local beliefs and arrived at something that was also based on the study of nature. Very, very simple shapes, and there's no reason, it's no surprise that the most important building in Islamic culture is also sort of a very stable box, just like the Stonehenge stones that we still have standing to this day. And you can see cultural sharing went the other way, so there's the ornamental rug in the religious Christian painting in the bottom right. And so we can continue, I could ask you to do this signature drawing exercise by copying the font of Disney. So we can see it's a very Obama-like in a way, so it's the gestures, the lines are very bouncy and very friendly. And we can compare it to all the round forms that we've seen up until now to understand why this kind of shape language is chosen for to convey the essence, the emotions that you're expected to experience by going to Disneyland. Elle magazine is shaped on sort of more something like an ancient Greek column. You get a sense of stability and elegance. And anthrax, not the deadly virus, but the thrash metal band, is based on a very triangular motif. So now imagine switching these styles of fonts around, switching the shape language around. So imagine if Disney was done in the style of anthrax. Would it look as family friendly then? It would be like asking your kids to go to Mordor for a holiday instead. We tend not to think of architecture as a tactile thing, something that we touch. No one sort of hugs buildings the same way that they hug trees. But we have to also perceive that they do have a tactile value based on the shape language. So if a building is round, it will also affect you on a very subconscious, pre-attentive level, in the same way that a very box-like building or a shard-like triangle stuck into the ground. And so if you're creating location-based games, this is a very important concept to apply, because you might have cultural content, you might have battles or friendships that are being built using a GPS gameplay system, but you might also consider where should this action take place and think about the architecture within your city and how that will influence the players on this subconscious level. Pathways have an even greater effect on us because, of course, rounded pathways tend to kind of uniquely exist in parks and places of leisure because they visually don't have any tension. They're very, very relaxing. But what's important is that they encourage us to move in a particular way. So you can especially feel as if you're cycling or on a moped. Going around pathways like this feels very different to, say, very jagged pathways. And pathways can also be influenced by traffic, for instance. So jagged movements are something that, traveling around Hyderabad is sort of very common. So this kind of feeling, you can see the pathway and the physical experience are very, very closely connected. If you're an interior designer, which kind of shape language you choose will also influence how people feel within that space. This is Google in Dublin, and you can see everything from the weave of the carpet. There's a path indicated across the floor, the rounded edges of the sofa, the coat hanger, the lampshades, the ceiling furniture. Everything is designed to create this kind of pleasant, relaxing, sort of very inspiring atmosphere. Whereas if we go back to the Denver Art Museum, which looks like a blade stuck into the ground, you can see by the banister this sharp edge and the angularity, which evoke this very dangerous tactile sensation. It's a completely different experience. So again, it's in architecture, urban city planning, and so on. What about if you're designing a website? We have the Volkswagen Beetle logo in the top right, which is circular, and of course, and what about the vehicle? Everything about this vehicle is based on the circular shape concept, from the hole for the door handles, the lights on the front, the wing mirrors, to the chassis itself of the vehicle. Everything about it, the visual DNA of this vehicle is based on the circular shape concept. Also, this extends to the environment too. What is in the environment? Predominantly, it's a bridge in the background, which directly echoes the vehicle itself. So what you have on a subconscious level is the message that this vehicle is very round and friendly, an open vehicle, lives in this environment. It's at home driving around in this space. What do you imagine would happen if I press on the arrow to switch the images, so to slide along the carousel? Would it be a very aggressive movement? Would it be sort of a more gentle one? Of course, it would be the more gentle one, so let's see what happens. Okay, so it's not aggressive. There's a slow in and slow out to the animations, a different image, but the same shape language for the environment. We have this circular half circle of a car and a half circle of the bridges in the background. So again, different scene, but this car lives there. It belongs in this world. Whereas what about the aggressive testosterone of the Lamborghini? So this is like Donald Trump's car, if we're sort of just connecting shape language to people. We start with the logo again. So which shape is the logo aligned to? Of course, it's more triangular. And the vehicle itself is one tense muscle. You know, from the bonnet, it's sort of like the tension lines that you have on your forehead when you're concentrating or angry. The lights, you know, sort of the cars today are designed to have this face embedded in the front, so you can see the eyes, the nose, the teeth, like a shark. Everything is tense and triangularized to create a particular aesthetic, something which is tactile and that we all understand. And there's a lot of this could be technical. They could be there for technical reasons to make the car more dynamic. But of course, a Porsche could be as fast. So a lot of this is actually shape language, taking cultural content. You know, this is a car, it needs four wheels and so on, so all the things that are functional and important to the vehicle. But there's a lot of shape language shaping the design and how you feel towards this car. What about the background? You know, it's the same thing. We have a triangular vehicle and a very jagged environment. So now what happens if we press on the button to switch the carousel? Is it going to be the same feeling, or you know, have the designers kind of been very conscious of the shape language being used? Of course, it's going to be much more faster. So there's almost no slow acceleration. It's just instant. You know, just the gesture is very, very violent by comparison. Different background, but the same shape language concept. The driver of this vehicle sees the world in a very aggressive way. You know, they've chosen this vehicle because of its edge-like, weapon-like associations. And the world that they live in, of course, is much more threatening and sort of something to be dominated, perhaps. What about comic book design? Do we find shape language there? So can anyone sort of perceive the shape language used to engineer the cultural content of this image? So here we have, you know, two space pirates sort of fighting each other. You know, comic books usually have horizontal and vertical borders, but of course you can see this has been tilted to create more tension. So we're shifting the shape language towards a triangle. The speech bubbles are also very prickly, very triangular. But what's important are the motion lines of the figure. So we can see from here, traveling across here. So there's actually a line linking the action from one side to the other. Of course, Japanese comics are read from right to left. And so what's important, what the key concept here is that the line is the narrative. If the artist had chosen a more kind of flowing line to arrange this cultural content upon, then the sensation, you know, the cultural content would be the same, but the sensation that you would get from this artwork on a subconscious level would be much gentler. The artist could have gone even further, because you can see the face is very rounded, the broom handle is also rounded. He could have sharpened these and make them really edgy and made the artwork more brutal. And so again, changing the narrative slightly. So the composition, this aesthetic value, the artistic value of this line is essential as an artist. You know, this is something that we can describe objectively and that speaks to an international audience. Can anyone see similar concepts applied to Hellboy? So we're going from Japan to America. You know, what is the shape language in this battle? You know, you can see from the painting on the back, there are all like the ornaments, the tusks, and the lines kind of stack up. Then we have the triangular. This is sort of like a summary of the whole action, two triangles divided by the spear, which takes us to the face. And then we have a very contorted line, which takes us to the next page. So again, the line is the narrative. It's so well composed that we don't even have to read the speech bubbles or pay attention to the actual elements of this artwork. The whole page is an artwork in itself, a holistic piece of artwork. But of course, Mike Mignola is such a master of composition that you can even see that the instances of red of Hellboy combine to form a triangular shape. So you can see that they come sort of here. And also the enemy, you can see there's a line linking here, which then takes a right angle and off to the next page. So all these functions that we looked at in Renaissance painting are being applied here. Composition is being used to simplify the artwork, to convey artistic value on a very subconscious level, and also to direct your eye to important narrative elements within the image. Back to Japan, Akira Kurosawa, one of the most celebrated directors of all time, he inspired George Lucas in the making of Star Wars because he spent so much time on the composition. You can see here there's a figure jumping off the ledge in the top right. But look at all the spears and the feet. So they're sort of positioned very, very meticulously to create a triangular composition. You know, especially things like this person holding a sword is kind of delicately placed there in alignment. Sort of legs, everything is directing us to this important action here. And of course, the shape itself is something that we associate with danger and a threat. And of course, he would have been doing a disservice to this composition if he'd used a circular shape language instead. Now we go to America, Guardians of the Galaxy. So these are things which happen very, very quickly, so it's often sort of very difficult to detect, but you can see, you know, there's a composition structure within this image. So can anyone see what that is? It's not a square balanced one, it's actually one that's tilting to one side. So again, the narrative is one of like a disbalance, like an unbalanced situation. And this is created by the actors standing in particular poses, so the framing of the silhouettes or the gestures of the arm. But of course, unlike Akira Kurosawa, who is doing everything with live action, in Guardians of the Galaxy, they have the advantage of being able to put foreground props and background props in digitally. So this could have all been filmed against a green screen. If anyone's seen the Lord of the Rings trilogy, then you'll know, or read the books, you know that the hobbits are good-natured, friendly, very innocent. So everything from the curl of their hair, the rounded shoulders, the round hobbit holes, the curved features of Hobbiton and the curved pathways underscore their temperament. You know, something about them on the inside is being projected outwards through shape language. How would you describe the elves? You know, they're very wise, very serious. And although the shape language is that of a leaf, and of course shape language can be really anything, the leaf is presented in a very balanced way. You know, they live in a forest full of vertical lines. You can see also the way their hair hangs down on the side. You know, this is sort of echo of this vertical form. Also, the arrows. You know, the sheath could have been put in at an angle, but the artist decided to put them in vertically to underscore the shape language. And of course, the Queen's pose as well is that of a leaf, but it's one that's very vertically positioned to underscore this serenity, this stability, just like Stonehenge, for instance. And on the other end of the triangular end of the shape spectrum, we have Sauron and Mordor. You know, from the tip of his glove to the triangular volcano on the landscape, everything echoes the triangular shape concept. And even in Pixar's Up, you know, Carl, the stubborn character who doesn't want to move, is based on the square, from his head to his glasses to his chair to his bed to his lamp on the side. Ellie is the round, spontaneous character that brings energy and dynamic energy to the relationship. You know, her head is round, her ears, her chair, her cup. Everything is designed to underscore this shape language. And this is why Pixar and Disney use these very, very basic shapes, is because they speak to an international audience and to people of all ages. You know, this is very, very important sort of hidden art of the visual side of communication. So we have to ask ourselves, you know, is this applicable to interactive media? Because what we've been looking at so far are paintings, comic books, films, animations. So these are things which we engage with visually. You know, there's, other than maybe adopting the pose voluntarily of one of the characters that you see, as in Buddhist culture, sort of Buddhist religion, there's no incentive to actually engage physically with the artwork. But there is what we know, if we just appreciate that composition and shape language is important to all other art forms, What we can do when we're translating these concepts is just to understand that we need to make them pervasive and dynamic. So pervasive means that they're visible everywhere, because when you're designing a third-person action adventure, for instance, the player is in control of the character and of the camera. So it means that they can freely walk around the environment, and you might design a nice composition just like a painting in a museum, but it's not necessarily the case that the player will go there and look at it in the way that you want them to. So when we're translating these concepts, they have to be visible wherever the camera is pointing and wherever the player is looking. And the other thing is to have them dynamic. A painting is painted, fixed, and then for hundreds of years or thousands of years later, it's going to be experienced in more or less the same way. Whereas when we're crafting video game experiences, we want them to be dynamic. You know, it's not just one emotion or aesthetic that we're dealing with. A narrative will have a constantly changing aesthetic. And this is where we tend to fall short in games where we have, up until now, you know, an action game is an action game, a game about socializing is about socializing, but we don't have this dynamic changing of aesthetics that we see in film and animation. And so it's important that we keep these in mind, pervasive and dynamic composition concepts. And it becomes a little easier to translate this if we just take this painting, that we've been looking at, interacting visually, and imagine placing it down on the ground and using these composition lines and the shape language as a pathway, something that we can interact with. And these are very interesting possibilities that emerge. And so this is sort of the framework that I've been developing it's been like 10 years at least, which breaks down the video game experience into 8 elements, and each of them, from big concepts to small ones, how do they physically affect the player. This is like the physical empathy, which is what makes games very, very unique. It's still a work in progress, but this is what I'll sort of jump through now. And so critical to this is the shape sensitivity, so really the understanding of the artistic value of each one of these shapes. So we've looked at the circle, square, and the triangle, and so I hope that you all appreciate now that the circle, why it's been sort of generally associated with concepts like movement, energy, grace, friendliness, and continuity, why the square has been traditionally used to convey balance, strength, restraint, tranquility, and rest, and the asymmetrical triangle sort of for force, instability, aggression, pain, agitation, and tension. So these are sort of now objective concepts because we can see they're rooted in our reality. And religions throughout history have adopted these to influence the way people feel and maybe even physically behave in front of religious artworks. What's important maybe to see is that we can blend these and combine secondary shapes or even more combinations. So you can see the triangle in the top right is like Buddha's pose, the half circle is like the Volkswagen Beetle, the tilted triangle in the bottom is like the Guardians of the Galaxy composition. But what's important to note is that the more we move away from these primary shapes, the more diluted and ambiguous their functionality becomes. The basic shapes, the circle, square, and triangle, are very objective. They're very easy to understand. The worst thing you can do, it's still something very valid, but when you start using cultural symbols like a leaf, for instance, then things start to become more ambiguous because, of course, a leaf might mean something in one culture and something else in a different culture. So that's why artists and Pixar especially, tend to always come back to these primary shapes. And of course, we're not dealing with just shapes. Volumes and lines are sort of all part of the family of shape language. And so it makes sense that we can even create a shape spectrum, something that we use as a comparative analysis tool. The idea is that you shouldn't change the way you work. You still work with cultural content. You say, I'm designing a character, has this function and everything, but we at least have some way to objectively tune our characters, our props, our environments. And of course, they can be idealized. They can be Kirby, which is just a circle. They can be sort of, or like the character from, or like this character, which is very rounded in a way, from Animal Crossing. And but they can also be sort of very much more on the realistic side. So you can see like the character from Deus Ex and Mass Effect. how would you describe these characters? They're very serious, a bit like the elves in The Lord of the Rings. So they're very serious, very mature. And it's not that they're based on they don't look like Minecraft characters. It's just their clothing has verticality within it, or like a very subdued hidden stripe on the shoulder. And even on the right side, we tend to think of triangular shapes being purely associated with enemy characters. But you can see this character is not evil. It's just, you can interpret, you could say she's edgy or sort of very dynamic. But it sort of says something about her. She's still a friendly character, but maybe as a backstory, she's had a troubling childhood, but sort of turned the energy into positivity. So the idea is that these concepts are still flexible, but we still understand the tactile value of them based on the examples that we have. And so what we come to now is, how do we apply this to the process of game design? So a game that's sort of inspired, the modern day chess. The usual approach to designing any game is, in a way, starting with the mechanics, then generating dynamics, and then aesthetics are, in a way, a byproduct. And so what I mean by mechanics is that mechanics are the game pieces, the possible actions within the system, and what the possibilities are and the rules, and what the possibilities are that they generate for the player. So once the player starts to interact with these, just like in a game of chess, the rules and the possible actions, what happens is dynamic situations arise. So the game of chess starts to visibly change from the setup at the beginning. The pieces start to dwindle down, and the pieces start to overlap on the board. And the aesthetics of this, the visual value of this, is something which is just a byproduct. In a way, it's not something you can ultimately predict. Often we talk about artistic backstories. So the backstory of chess can change. You can have Star Wars chess pieces, you can have medieval chess pieces. These are sort of almost not important to the game itself. What is important is what is the artistic impression that this artwork gives us, and that is two lines of opponents facing off each other, and that they march towards each other in a particular way. So this is the normal way that we design games. Mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics are sort of like a byproduct. Whereas what my framework proposes is that we can start by thinking about the aesthetics first. What we've been looking at today is like how lines influence the physical experience and the emotions of the player. So why not think about the king moves very timidly? What is the physical sensation of this? The queen can move much further, or the knight has a very angular motion. So we can kind of link these to even the signature drawing exercise that we did here. And then we design that creates dynamic experiences, this kind of sensation of movement. And then we start to define the mechanics around this experience. So this is called sensory design. You use it in architecture, where you define what are the functions in the environment and how the space will be used, and then you design the space around it. And so the idea is that the game might even arrive at the same visual impression, but what we're doing is we're designing from the inside outwards, from the player's physical experience first. So this applies to the whole spectrum of games. On the right, we have Proteus, which has no rules at all. It's just you go in the environment and you do what you want. There's nothing even to interact with particularly. And then on the left, we have Super Mario Odyssey, which is a formal game. So it's a game which has objectives, has rules. Games like this often have very heavy user interfaces because the goal of play is to win at something. And the user interface tells you how well you're doing. When you hit an enemy, something is very visual. It tells you you've done something wrong, and you're very guided in a very strict way towards your objective. Whereas the best application for this framework is the games that come in the middle. So games which don't have a user interface like Inside, where there might be some puzzles, but it's really about the aesthetic experience and identifying, empathizing with the character that you're controlling. But you'll find that this framework applies to all, so because it's the physical experience, which is ultimately, what is the essence of gaming. One thing that we have to think about is what is our character guided or synchronized? So there is an important distinction here, because in a game like Monument Valley, when you want your character to move, you tap on the tile that you want them to walk to. And this has no connection to the movement of the character, because what you've done is just tapped in one location, but the character, of course, is moving around the screen like this, along these lines. Whereas synchronized characters are the kind of interactions that I like to focus on, because those are the interactions where we can create this heightened sense of empathy. Because in a game like Journey, Assassin's Creed, Uncharted, when you press left on your controller, when you pull left on your controller, the character moves left. When you pull right on your controller, your character moves right. And so we have this very synchronized experience. And so how we curate the motion lines, the possibilities for these characters to move, will have a much more powerful effect on us physically. And this is what we really have to understand. This is what's so special, the most powerful effect that we can have on players is through these motion lines, curating the kind of motion lines that our characters are capable of. So in Journey, at the beginning of the game, if you press the jump button, the character jumps very gracefully, and the camera rotates very slowly. And the experience is a bit like if you took the Obama signature and just copied it for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. You start to embody and physically empathize with that character. Whether you like it or not, it's going to happen just because you're repeating gestures of what you're seeing. Whereas in a game like Vanquish, the movements are much more angular. So it's like the Donald Trump signature, where after 5 minutes, 10 minutes, even if you came to the experience very relaxed, it's going to start to agitate you because you start to physically empathize with this character. And so I have three gameplay sequences here. If I could ask you just to hold up your hands like this again and try to follow the characters around, just mirroring what the gestures that they're doing. So you just, when the character swings left or swings right, so just try to get a feeling for what this is like. Or if you prefer, you can also draw on a piece of paper and try to follow what you see on screen. Like 5 minutes. Okay. Okay, so just horizontal, vertical lines, how do they feel in your shoulder? And then Vanquish. So you can see the character, the camera compared to Journey flickers around. The character changes direction very, very quickly. And so how does this, these are curated motion lines. These dramatically affect the player's physical experience. But as I said before, Vanquish is all about this aggression. If there's any sort of emotional setting, sort of emotional action in this, it's kind of put into the cutscenes where the player is actually not interacting with the character. What's important is that we start to integrate this shape language, these concepts on a more dynamic level during gameplay. In a game like StarCraft 2, it might not be, you're no longer controlling a particular character, but you can see that the attack units, which I'll play in the top right, have their collision switched on. So the animations are more like the Lamborghini website, where the movement creates a very erratic, nervous vibration. Whereas the resource gathering units in the bottom right are a bit more like the Volkswagen Beta website, and the collisions are switched off, so they can pass over each other very smoothly. So you can see the attack units. So as a player, you don't even have to pay attention, you don't even have to focus on these units directly. The visual impression that the shape language generates helps you to orientate yourself around the screen. I'll skip over this one. It's just an example from Halo 4 where the concept has failed because the character is in a very dramatic situation, but there's no lateral movement whatsoever. So in the end, even though it's a high-stakes situation, the player is just basically just stationary, and there's no physical, there's this ludonarrative dissonance. And so how do you design games from this perspective? This is a sketchbook drawing by Sterling Hundley, which I just discovered 2 days ago. And so the idea is like the first-hand research is where we begin. We don't begin with rules and objectives, actually line prototyping. And the idea is this is a fantastic sketch because it combines observation and also just the general shapes. You can see the lines which are important that he's observed in this environment. But they could also be much simpler. You could just prototype lines, just to, like we did with the signature drawing exercise, And you can even give those lines to someone to try. You can say, take this sketchbook and actually trace over these lines. How do you feel when you play that? Does it kind of help you empathize with a particular character? This is where we begin. First-hand research is very important. In Journey, the team went to the desert to actually get a feeling for what it was like to be in the desert. How does sand behave? The UFC, EA Sports team, the creative director offered to be actually strangled and passed out. And Giant Squid, Matt Navar, was also a passionate diver. So in designing Apsu as well, it was this first-hand experience. It's not objectives and rules, it's actually experience which drives the design process. Then we also have things like, then you have to curate the motions of your character. So we go immediately to trying to create a base motion set for this character. So, in Mario is a good example because it is curated to evoke circular movements. Players don't like to have their speed reduced, so we tend to have more circular movements there. And once we've kind of created at least even just a basic soundtrack, a base motion set based on our researched lines, what we have is the equivalent of the holodeck or the construct in the Matrix. And this is where we start to begin defining the mechanics or like the objectives. And we can think of objectives on a very global level, which is where we begin on a push and pull system. So because, say, if you have like an objective like the end of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, the objective is to get to that mountain, and if there were nothing in the way, the player would just walk straight. So when we're thinking about objectives, it's just how they affect the player's movements. It's just a very linear process to begin with. We just want the player to go here using the curated lines, motion lines that we have. We can also think about pushing them. So the Fortnite, the storm, also pushes them in a particular direction. So it's push and pull. Or even a global phenomena like in Minecraft, this night and day cycle, again, can also affect movement on a very global scale. It's always, how does it affect movements? Also the pathways, the distinction between, like in Pac-Man as well, they're sort of very closely bound to the player's ability. But of course, Pac-Man could conceptually actually evoke rounded movements. But that would only happen if we enlarge the pathways. And the minute we start to funnel the player in, the tighter the pathways become, the more we can affect their movements, again, using shape language. And this might conflict with the base motion sets, which might be a particular aesthetic. Pathways can also be defined by obstacles, like a crowd. They can also be applied to the building. Things like this. They also apply to more realistic video games. So Emilia Schatz, a lead designer on Uncharted 4, uses them in her environment to, emphasize that I can be useful shapes, because it's about parkouring, and this kind of visual clarity is very, very important in the same way that it is in composition, in classical paintings. The functionality, to avoid the rough terrain on either side of a track, or to avoid the beaten track and actually use the environment to the high grass. These are things which can start to affect the player's movements when you combine the visuals with the functionality of the artwork. Resources, the placement of resources, and even down to the shape of the character. So we have form. Mario is a very rounded figure, and sort of what does this function? How is this represented on a functional level? He bounces around the environment. So his shape actually makes sense. Even his gesture here is kind of aligned to a large circle. If we keep the cultural content, so Mario and all his dungarees and all his features, and change the shape language, then we get a different set of characters. These are, in effect, 4 versions of Mario, just with a different shape language. Even Waluigi, we can now see that maybe he references Buddha's protector in a way, on a very powerful level in his pose. Luigi maybe references an ancient Greek column in a way, whereas Wario, of course, has a lightning bolt gesture, and the sharpness of his eyebrows and his mustache evoke this powerful sense of aggression. And even the way that we visualize gameplay, and I think this is one of the most powerful tools where On the left, we have a sniper from the Halo franchise. And you can see that at long distance, he's very, very dangerous and in a particular direction. So this will evoke particular movements. So the player will be tempted to circle around at long distance, whereas an elite of an energy sword is dangerous at very close distance, and this will evoke different types of movements. So you can all download the basis of this lecture from gumroad.com at Solarski Studio. To sort of learn more about the background. I hope to publish the framework itself within about 2 months or so. But what I want to highlight is that, Ralph Costa, for instance, he highlights that psych tends not to be that amenable to math because we tend to create experiences that focus on numbers. This character's at level 110, which has no emotional value whatsoever on the surface. But I just want to highlight how important and the close relationship between maths, geometry, and shape language is, and how when it's used effectively, if we design games using shapes, how we can really heighten this physical experience and approach game design from a different perspective. And drawing is surprisingly the tool that we use for this experience. So be craftspeople first before you think of yourselves as game designers. So thank you very much, and apologies, and thank you for the team for their patience and yes, yeah.